The cold rainfall over Seattle felt less like weather and more like a quiet judgment. Inside the crystal ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel, glittering chandeliers cast warm golden light across 200 guests dressed in tailored silks and sharp tuxedos. Wealth whispered from every corner of the room. But when 72-year-old Robeert Hayes stepped through the heavy glass doors, the low hum of upper-class chatter ceased almost instantly. Robeert wore a faded, weathered brown coat, its cuffs fraying after decades of hard labor. His shoes bore the dull coating of city street dust, and in his right hand he held a scratched blue steel lunchbox, a quiet, constant companion from his 35 years working long hours as a city maintenance crew chief. He didn't come to eat the expensive food or admire the ice sculptures. He came for one reason only: to walk his daughter, Claire, down the aisle. Before Robeert could even approach the silk-draped guest registry, the groom, Julian Vance, stepped forward. Julian, a rising young venture capitalist from a lineage of old money, looked at Robeert with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He raised his hand, pointing an accusatory finger across the polished marble floor. His voice cut through the silent room like a blade. "Who let this street beggar into my wedding?" Nearly 200 people stood frozen beneath the chandeliers. Nobody spoke. Nobody stepped forward to defend the elderly black man whose quiet eyes reflected decades of enduring silent indignities. Security guards moved in swiftly, their heavy boots echoing on the stone. Robeert didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice or drop his head in shame. He gently lifted the scratched blue lunchbox and spoke with a calm, deep dignity that made the air feel suddenly heavy. "I'm Claire's father." Julian laughed, a harsh, cold sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Claire's father is a respected businessman, not a homeless man carrying garbage into my venue. Get him out of here before I cancel the caterers." Without another word, the security guards escorted Robeert toward the exit. As his worn shoes slipped slightly on the wet threshold, the contents of his blue lunchbox spilled onto the marble floor. A single folded piece of paper, a worn silver pocket watch, and a small tarnished brass key slid across the stone. Robeert knelt down, his aged knees cracking in the quiet hall, gathering his few belongings without uttering a single complaint. He stepped out into the pouring rain, alone. To understand Robeert Hayes is to understand the quiet, unyielding sacrifice of a generation that asked for nothing and gave everything. Born in the segregated South, Robeert moved north in the early 1970s with little more than a high school education and an unwavering work ethic. When his wife passed away shortly after giving birth to Claire, Robeert swore an oath to raise their daughter with every opportunity the world had denied him. He took on double shifts with the city infrastructure department, descending into dark storm drains in the freezing winter and repairing scorching asphalt in the dead of summer. His hands became thick with calluses, his shoulders permanently sloped from heavy lifting, and his back constantly ached. But every night, no matter how exhausted he was, Robeert sat at a small kitchen table helping Claire with her homework. He saved every extra nickel in an old glass jar, sacrificing basic comforts so she could attend elite private schools, where she was often the only black girl in her class. Julian Vance met Claire in graduate school. Julian came from a family whose wealth was built on inheritance and corporate acquisitions. To Julian and his social circle, value was measured exclusively in designer labels, country club memberships, and pristine resumes. When Claire introduced Julian to her father by video call, Julian saw only a retired laborer living in a modest wood frame house in South Seattle. In Julian's mind, Robeert was an embarrassment, a stark reminder of a background he believed would diminish his family's elite social standing. What Julian never bothered to learn was the truth behind the faded brown coat. Robeert had quietly invested every spare penny of his modest city pension into forgotten residential real estate in the late 1980s, working through long weekends to restore dilapidated homes himself. He didn't do it for luxury. He did it to guarantee that no member of his family would ever know the bitter taste of poverty again. 30 minutes after Robeert was forced out into the rain, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open once more. A tall man in a bespoke charcoal suit stepped into the foyer, flanked by two personal aides. It was Marcus Sterling, the 50-year-old billionaire founder of Sterling Global Tech, one of the most powerful real estate and technology conglomerates in the Pacific Northwest. Julian Vance's face instantly lit up. Securing Marcus Sterling's attendance at the wedding had taken 6 months of aggressive networking. Having Sterling's capital backed Julian's new venture firm would secure his financial future for a generation. Julian rushed toward the entrance, extending a hand with practiced charm. "Mr. Sterling, what an immense honor! We were beginning to think you couldn't make it." Marcus Sterling didn't take Julian's hand. His eyes swept across the ballroom, landing on the wet floor near the entrance where faint mud marks still remained from Robert's worn shoes. Sterling's expression was unreadable, cold as steel. "Where is Robeert?" Sterling asked, his voice low, steady, and carrying an unmistakable weight that silenced the surrounding crowd. Julian blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Robeert? I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We had a transient intruder earlier, but security handled it. The ceremony is ready to start." Marcus Sterling took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze locking onto Julian with terrifying intensity. "I am not asking about a transient, Julian. I am asking about Robeert Hayes, the man who walked in here 10 minutes ago carrying a blue steel lunchbox." Julian's smile faltered, a cold knot forming in his stomach. You know him?" Marcus turned to face the entire ballroom, his voice echoing clearly against the high ceilings so that every guest, family member, and investor heard every single word. 40 years ago, Marcus began, my mother was a widowed domestic worker, raising 3 children in a damp basement apartment 3 blocks from here. When she fell ill and couldn't pay rent, our landlord placed our belongings on the sidewalk in the middle of November. The city crew working on the street saw us sitting on those cold boxes. Marcus paused, taking a deep breath as the room fell into absolute silence. One man on that crew walked over. He didn't look down on us. He didn't judge my mother's worn dress or my torn coat. He went to his truck, grabbed his own lunchbox, and shared his food with 3 hungry children. Then he went to his union hall, put up his own modest home as collateral, and paid our back rent so we wouldn't freeze on the streets. Marcus looked directly at Julian, his eyes burning with quiet fury. That man spent 35 years working in the dirt so children like me and a daughter like Claire could stand in rooms like this today. He gave me my first job at 16. He bought me my first suit for a college interview. Robeert Hayes is not a street beggar, Julian. He is the chairman of the Sterling Foundation's Board of Trustees. He owns 60% of the commercial land beneath this very hotel. Marcus paused, letting the crushing weight of his words settle over the stunned crowd. And above all that, Marcus added softly, he is the man I have called Dad for 30 years. The ballroom was dead silent. Julian's face drained of all color, his hand falling limply to his side. Guests began to whisper in shock, looking at Julian with newfound disdain. Claire, who had just stepped out in her white wedding dress from the bridal suite, overheard the final revelation and stopped in her tracks, tears streaming down her face as she realized what her fiancé had done. Julian stammered, his arrogance completely shattered. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't know. I thought, that is your precise problem, Julian. You measure a human being's worth by the polish on their shoes rather than the soul inside their chest. You are unworthy of his daughter, and you are certainly unworthy of his blessing. Marcus turned on his heel and walked straight back out into the rain. Outside, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the hotel awning, was Robeert Hayes. He had wiped off his blue lunchbox and was quietly sitting with his hands folded in his lap, watching the rain hit the pavement with the quiet serenity of a man whose character had been tested and proven decades ago. Marcus walked up to the old man, took off his own expensive wool coat, and gently placed it around Robert's shoulders. He sat down beside him on the wet bench. "You didn't have to stay out here in the cold, Dad," Marcus said gently. Robert looked up at Marcus. A faint, warm smile touched his eyes. He reached out with his rough, calloused hand and patted Marcus's knee. "A man who knows who he is, son, can never be disgraced by someone who doesn't know who they are. I just wanted to make sure Claire was okay." Moments later, the glass doors opened once more. Claire ran out into the rainy afternoon, lifting her white gown above the wet pavement, crying as she threw her arms around her father's neck. She handed her ring back to Julian inside the hall, choosing the unshakable love of the father who built her life over the fragile pride of a man who could not respect him. As Marcus's driver pulled up to the curb, Robeert Hayes gathered his blue lunchbox one last time. He walked away from the Grand Hotel, not as a victim of arrogance, but as a giant of dignity, a quiet reminder to a loud world that true royalty is never found in wealth or status, but in the enduring strength of a noble heart.